You're listening to episode 288 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ethan Nichtern returns to the podcast to speak about his book, The Dharma of the Princess Bride, what the coolest fairy tale of our time can teach us about Buddhism and relationships. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. The Dharma, those lessons about how we live our lives and the suffering that is an inherent aspect of conditioned existence, can be found in the most interesting places. Sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. What the Buddha's teaching has to tell us about life is often represented in fiction, movies and books. Why would this not be so of the now classic The Princess Bride? Ethan Nichtern is a senior teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist tradition and the author of The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, and One City, a declaration of interdependence. He is also founder of the Interdependence Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to secular Buddhist study as it applies to transformational activism, mindful arts and media projects, and Western psychology. Ethan has taught meditation and Buddhist studies classes and retreats across the United States since 2002. He's based in New York City. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Princess Bride tea. Not kidding, that's a thing. Our guest today returning to the podcast is Ethan Nichtern. Ethan, welcome back. Glad to have you.
Thanks so much, Ted. Good to see you and hear you again, and good to be back on the podcast.
So we're talking about your latest book, which I was very excited to see when it came out, because of course this is one of my favorite books and films. And I want to start by asking you, what did you do first? Did you read the book or see the movie?
Yeah. So The Dharma of the Princess Bride. So I saw the movie first when I was 9 years old, fall of 1987. I didn't know about the book. The reason I saw the movie was because my dad's best friend growing up was in the movie, which is Christopher Guest, who played the six-fingered man, Count Rugen, bad guy, which is kind of hilarious in and of itself. Actually, revisiting the movie a bunch of times, talking about writing the book and talking about the book, it's amazing how underused his abilities as a comedic actor actually are. He just plays a straight up villain. But I didn't actually know about the book. And I think a lot of people my age didn't really know about the book. It was written by a famous Hollywood screenwriter, William Goldman. But I think I read the book for the first time maybe 5 years ago. I've read the book twice, but I've seen the movie maybe 30 or 40 times. So it was the movie first for me.
Great. And I didn't know that your dad was that directly related to the movie. Awesome.
Yeah, there's I actually in writing the my book, I actually, interdependence is a beautiful thing, and actually found three distinct connections. One is my father's lifelong friendship with Christopher Guest. My first girlfriend in college, who I mentioned in the book, that when she broke up with me, that's when I knew I was a Buddhist. And when she dumped me, that's when I knew I was. She actually went to high school with the whole Savage family, so she knew Fred Savage a little bit. And my father is a musician and composer, and as well as Buddhist teacher. And he actually, when I was a kid, sold very high-end musical synthesizer equipment, and he actually supposedly sold the synthesizer to Mark Knopfler, who wrote the score for The Princess Bride. So three distinct connections, and then I got to make a connection with Mandy Patinkin in writing my book, which was really nice. So, yeah.
So why do you see? We'll just start with the film. Why do you see that as really cool? What did you like about it?
I think a lot of it was lost on me at the beginning. It's clear that it's aged well, and I think it's sort of aged with the sort of coming to dominance of, and it's gotten way, way, way more popular to the point where it's now one of the most popular movies of all time, which was not at all the case when it came out. It was like 41st in the box office in 1987. Number one that year was a movie called Three Men and a Baby. And
Steve Gutenberg and the rest.
Yeah. And I don't think there's ever going to be a book called The Dharma of Three Men and a Baby. I think it's because there was this aging of the kind of irony of the movie. So the first time I saw it, I just thought it was like some older kid like making fun of fairy tales, but there was still something very homey, very warm about it at the same time. So, I think that sort of like it's a deconstruction of a genre, but it's also a deconstruction of a genre, of a narrative structure that also really celebrates the genre and celebrates the act of storytelling as a familial act. And so it's like an optimistic deconstruction. And it's very rare in our world, I think, to see like an optimistic deconstruction of a genre. And just to be clear, I'm not arguing that it's intentionally a Buddhist text. It's really, my book is more about trying to learn about relationships while studying Buddhism and living within modern popular culture. And I thought this was just a great movie as a narrative backdrop to live one's life as in terms of coming to terms with relationships. So, but I do think that that's the deep Buddhist theme of why I think the movie's so cool now, and I think so many other people do, is it's a deconstruction, but it's an optimistic one. It's one that leads towards love. So in that sense, I think it's very Buddhist.
So let's talk some more about some of the other Dharma tie-ins that struck you over time, seeing this as you were younger and then growing into it, even though you were raised in Buddhist culture. There was more stuff that must have come up over time. Say a little bit more about some of that.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at the actual movie itself, I mean, I think there's a lot of one-liners that are very Dharma tie-ins. I think, we could definitely argue, and I got to talk to Mandy Patinkin about this, on whether the revenge theme is completely anti-Buddhist. Inigo Montoya's quest for revenge against the six-fingered man, aka my father's best friend. So, I think one of the themes that is really Buddhist is the bad guys. I argue in my book that the three bad guys, Wallace Shawn's Vizzini, the six-fingered man, Count Rugen, and Prince Humperdinck, not to be confused with Prince Trumperdinck, that they map perfectly onto a Buddhist teaching called the three poisons, or the three root afflictions: ignorance, aggression or hatred, and greed or desirous attachment. So I think and then there's a lot of one-liners, that can be contemplated in a Buddhist thought process, like get used to disappointment, life is pain, highness, etc., which we could argue whether or not that's a little too dark to actually be Buddhist. The interactions of a lineage of the grandfather and grandson telling the story in the so-called real world, and how we really understand our spiritual tradition through storytelling, more than we think we do, through that kind of cultural mechanism. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moments, but really what was important to me is actually having some piece of pop culture that you love as a narrative while you're trying to figure out your relationship life and your spiritual life, which is what the last 30 years have been. So I don't one of the places that that writing this book came to me, there's really two places it came to me. One was the publisher of my first book, called One City had just published a book, which I think you're familiar with, called The Dharma of Star Wars,
Yep.
which is a little bit more like an analysis of the Jedi code from a Buddhist perspective.
Right. The
And
author of that, Bertolini, was a guest on the podcast to talk about it years ago.
So it's a fun book for sure.
Yeah.
So when I saw that book, I said, if I ever do something like that, I'm going to do it with The Princess Bride. And then there was a desire to really be very personal and transparent, as a Buddhist practitioner and teacher, about my own journey with relationships, friendship, romance, and family. But I wanted to do that without coming across as dogmatic, or overly like, I know what's going on. Because one of the big themes of my book is, that expertise is not really applicable to relationships, because, that the term relationship expert is actually an oxymoron, because relationship is at least two people, and expert is one lone person who knows a subject matter. And so the idea that a relationship is actually relinquishing expertise. So I wanted a way for myself to talk about friendship, romance, and family, and to talk about my own ideas about it, my own struggles with it, my own attempts to understand it as a modern Buddhist practitioner, but that allowed some foil or some playfulness, and just kind of all the great memes and themes of this movie, and just loving modern pop culture in general, created a good sort of cocktail mix for writing a book about relationships without having to seem like a relationship expert.
So those are some really good tie-ins. I'm wondering what some of the lessons that came for you that arose out of those tie-ins. What about Buddhism and relationships? What was there for you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is, I would say, interesting, and I cover this in the first part of my book, is insofar as The Princess Bride is this hilarious hero's narrative, and it seems like it's going to be sort of this like super heroic, super deft, super witty. I talk about Wesley, the man in black, as sort of like Ferris Bueller meets Errol Flynn or something like that. And the idea that he's going to like beat the bad guys, but actually it's him and his friends, he's paralyzed as he's actually moving through so it's actually not a classic like individual hero's journey. And it's looking at how much we rely on friends and relationships to actually accomplish a task. And sometimes our friendships are quite wacky. Sometimes they seem quite accidental. But that part of the movie really speaks to me, especially when I'm studying so much in terms of this sort of one way of looking at Buddhist teachings as a path of individual liberation, where so much of the science and neuroscience is talking about awakening as based on having a supportive environment and supportive relationships for awakening. So we often really underpresent how important social relationships are to our individual paths, and bringing in the wacky friendships and kind of awkward heroes, Inigo Montoya, Andre the Giant's Fezzik, Wesley, Miracle Max, Valerie, all these kind of wacky people who help on the quest. It's a good way of sort of getting over that myth that you're going to do this all by yourself. And so really go into some of that in the friendship section. The notion in the romance section, I use the notion of buttercup as this sort of like hilarious send up of romantic objectification. In the first chapter of that section is called There Is No Buttercup. So the idea that we're always questing for our princess, but William Goldman and Rob Reiner in this movie and book do like an amazing job having this sort of like trophy damsel, but her name's Buttercup. And so the whole thing is kind of a joke. And, it's been interesting because Robin Wright, who stars as Princess Buttercup, was also in the new movie Wonder Woman, which is sort of heated as this, very feminist empowerment movie. And there's memes about how her role as a general in that movie is totally different from the damsel in distress with the all-male cast. But I also think there's something about the hilarity of looking for your salvation through romance in the name Buttercup that's actually about undercutting objectification. So that notion of letting go of your romantic myth and still having some kind of like actual belief in romance is a big part of the tie-in for the second section of the book. And then really looking into family, how family dynamics work. And, obviously the grandfather and grandson in the movie, in Goldman's book version, he says he received the story from his father, but actually William Goldman wrote The Princess Bride because his daughters wanted a bedtime story, and he said, what should it be about? And one said a princess and the other said a bride, and that's where this came from. So it's really his sort of funny gift to his children. And so looking at the whole thing is couched as like family is really the stories that we tell. And, you know, I had a lot of the year that this came out, 1987, 1988. My parents' Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, who played a really central role in their life, passed away. You know, I think it would be very fair and honest to say prematurely. And my grandfather, who was at the time, you know, was like my closest non-parental relative, he and his wife, my step grandmother, committed suicide together. So there's a real contemplation of sort of like, how do you connect with your family lineage? And so because my favorite chapter title in my book is Fred Savage is a Jerk and I am Fred Savage. And just that notion of realizing that we are the spoiled grandchild, and how do we actually come to terms with healing some of our wounds towards our family, but also honoring the stories and the lineage that our family passes along to us. So that's kind of the tie-in for the third section of the book.
So looking at the film side of it and some more lighter questions, who's your favorite character?
Yeah, there is a field of good choices here. And that's, you know, that's also kind of the ability of, I think why this has been so timeless is every character kind of deviates from their storybook norm. But I have to say, I have to keep saying that Andre the Giant's Fezzik is my favorite. And, you know, he's just really a good friend, and he's this giant, but he's also a poet, and he's just along for the ride, and he wants to help. And there's something very disarming about his character. And, you know, supposedly he was in quite a lot of back pain the whole filming of the movie. He had a massive back brace on, and he's, you know, carrying people up the cliffs of insanity. So I think that's a good analogy for bodhisattva, like being a really generous giant, but you're in back pain, you know, and maybe a good analogy for overexerting yourself as a bodhisattva. But there's something very disarming about him. And whenever I see Shepard Fairey's art, you know, the Obey posters that use Andre the Giant's visage in a kind of more Orwellian style, I always imagine it's Fezzik.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's also been my favorite because of the kindness of the character.
Yeah.
Unabashed and so open-hearted that was always very appealing.
Yeah. I think in terms of like 2017 life, I think the most informative character probably for life in a democratic society in 2017 is probably Wallace Shawn's Vizzini, who I would say is another, you know, most often quoted inconceivable character, and just representing that sort of like thinking you know something and thinking anything that disagrees is fake news, you know, just the total unwillingness to receive any new information. Then he falls into a trap of duality, and that's what ends up getting him killed. So it's a very Buddhist lesson there.
So that's a good segue for quotes. What's your favorite quote? Again, from a wide field of wonderful choice.
Yes. So I've been asked a couple times what the most Buddhist quote is, and there's one quote in the movie that is often attributed as the most Buddhist quote, but I think it's a slight misinterpretation of the First Noble Truth, which is when Wesley has not revealed himself to his true love. He's still the Dread Pirate Roberts, the man in black. He hasn't unmasked, and he is kind of mad at her. So he says, you know, she says, "You mock my pain," and he says, "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something." Interestingly enough, that line's also in the book version of The Princess Bride, but it's given to Fezzik's mother. It's totally different setting. So life is pain. You know, I think this is a subtle, very common misinterpretation that Buddhists think life is only pain. And I think that was almost Buddhist. It's a little too cynical, and he's a little too negative in the line's delivery. I think the more Buddhist version of the line would be life includes pain. Necessarily, that's part of life. Anybody who says differently is selling something. But I think the most Buddhist line, and I think this is especially related to my tradition, the Shambhala teachings, is again given to Fezzik when his friend Inigo is preparing to duel with the man in black, and he's about to finish coming up the cliffs of insanity. Fezzik says to Inigo, "You be careful. People in masks cannot be trusted." And I think that's the most Buddhist line, that people in masks cannot be trusted, that there's this notion that a spiritual path might be about like finding a better mask. And instead, the notion is that this is a process of becoming more and more authentically present with who you are and who other people are. And that's where real mindfulness comes from and real compassion comes from. So that's my favorite line. People in masks cannot be trusted.
Was there anything surprising to you that you learned while you were writing the book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that, when I got to, through a friend, I got to connect with Mandy Patinkin. One level of surprise was that Mandy Patinkin's a meditator, and even went so far as to identify as a Jubu, which for those of you not from, New York City, or maybe somewhere else, but the Jubu is a very common term for people who both identify as a Jewish practitioner and a Buddhist practitioner. So, I wrote that in the book, that Inigo Montoya meditates every day. No pressure though. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to him is he had written an op-ed piece in Time magazine called "The Real Politics in the Princess Bride," about him coming to terms with how it's not really the movie about revenge. It's not really about just wanting to kill your enemy, but that he thinks and hopes Inigo might have learned a lesson at the end of the movie, that he could have done something different with his life. And the surprising thing is that the reason he wrote this was he found out that one of the biggest fans of this movie, kind of in the whole world, surprisingly, was Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who's somebody that he had very little in common with Mandy Patinkin politically, somebody I have very little in common with politically. But Ted Cruz does amazing impressions of the characters in the movie. You can go YouTube, him doing Billy Crystal's Miracle Max in a beautiful, beautiful way. And so, obviously you could think like, this is a person who maybe has missed the point about this being about true love, and like and this is a big contemplation right now for Buddhist practitioners, like, what does it really mean to want to generate love and compassion for your society? And I don't think it means staying out of politics. Right. But at the same time, if I can't acknowledge Ted Cruz's humanity, and so to imagine him alongside reading all these blog posts I've read about Ted Cruz, where, his college roommate says he's basically the worst person he's ever met, which made me feel really bad. Like, I hope my college roommate says nice things about me, or at least says
what it must be like to have, in some fashion, had someone have that view about you.
Yeah. Yeah. So to contemplate, and I did contemplate this, and I put this in the last section, the family section of the book, is like, what would it be like? How would I handle it if Ted Cruz were a cousin of mine? And cousins are actually degrees of separation. That's actually the human relationship we all share. He is a cousin of mine. He's like a, however many times removed and however many number cousin. But how would I relate to him? Would I tell him like that his healthcare views are maniacal, which I do think they are. I think they're literally insane. That might not be a good conversation starter. It might be a better conversation starter to say like, hey, do your Miracle Max for me, or like, tell me about the first time you saw this movie, to create some like human connection first. And so that was surprising. Also, finding out the different connections that I had to this movie, finding out that different connections a few of the characters had to meditation and Buddhism, finding out just really, I mean, I knew this in just from my own experience and from research, but this movie is now, according to the website 538.com, this is the 6th most rewatchable movie of all time. So finding out how much something that had been important to me has touched so many people, all of these were really good surprises. And there's some kind of shared humanity in the hilarious deconstruction of this movie that is, again, there's no meditation, but we don't meditate, at least in my way of looking at things, just to meditate, right? We meditate to touch in with some human wisdom and some human presence. And we can also do that through social and cultural sharing. And that's a big part of the Shambhala teachings, is really looking at culture as an offering that can either suppress our awareness and lead to more confusion and grasping and hatred and isolation, or that can really actually bring people together, and it's very clear this movie has served a very dharmic purpose culturally. It's like it really actually has helped quite a lot of people.
So, Ethan, on a personal level, what was your favorite lesson that you took from The Princess Bride?
Yeah. I mean, I think because the character I identify with is the grandson character. And, I know that feeling of sort of not appreciating what others do for you, because you're kind of locked up in being sick, or you're locked up in like fourth grade or whatever it is. And I had a hard time in fourth grade, but just that ability to actually generate gratitude for the people around you. And sort of, it does feel like his grandfather really generates gratitude. And then the notion of really the true love and the kind of unconditional devotion that comes from the line, as you wish, which I think you could also argue is the most Buddhist line in the movie. Just that sort of like willingness to actually hold my human relationships in that same level of gratitude, even when I'm having a hard time, even when I still feel like that spoiled brat, which I think thankfully my practice and life path and being a parent now has helped me to, maybe have that, to soothe that spoiled brat inwardly a little bit more. But yeah, I really think that the gratitude is really the most important practice, and just appreciation of our relationships.
Anything else you want to share with the listeners?
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting. I always, when I'm on your podcast, always feel like, this notion of secular Buddhism, which is something that's close to my heart. Although my tradition, the real argument that's made in my tradition is that it's the split between the sacred and the secular that was a construct. And so it's all secular, it's all sacred. But I do think that, this notion of really taking Buddhist teachings to heart, but not viewing them as separate from your scientific or cultural or political or secular life in the world, that's where I've seen all the benefit in my practice, is when I actually try to apply my practice and these teachings to secular life. That's where all the most interesting conversations are having. I'm not saying that I wouldn't like to have a conversation with other spiritual leaders, but the interesting conversations I'm having about meditation and Buddhism are with artists, are with psychologists, are with neuroscientists, are with politicians. And so I just, I think sometimes people, when they're really interested in like, can I really apply this to my life? If there's any permission I could give as a Buddhist practitioner or teacher, I really think you can really take a fully embodied real life approach to this. This does not have to be some mystical religion. And I'm really excited by all the mindfulness and other Buddhist movements that are really bringing that to the forefront. And I think our world needs it, because there's so much confusion. Yeah, I just want to thank you for all the work you're doing, Ted. And it's always great to reconnect.
I gotcha. And that's one of the reasons we do have a shared focus of, you are not a bad Buddhist if you also care about the world and others' lives.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, you could say you're a confused Buddhist if you don't care about the world.
I might think along those lines, although I always want to leave that open to, I'm not the right person to judge what someone else finds of value based on their experience. And that's always a tricky thing, honoring that while also having appropriate boundaries about, and here's what's right for me in my practice in this world.
Yeah, but I like your use of the term bad Buddhist, because that's something I play with in my book, that notion of like, being a child's divorce of two Buddhist parents, tell a story of doing something wrong in fourth grade, like wrong meaning harmful and problematic, and sort of feeling like the worst Buddhist kid in the world, and sort of playing with that idea constantly of like, are we okay to do these practices and take on these teachings? And because it can feel overwhelming, because sometimes when we start practicing, we just notice all the obstacles or all the confusion. So I like to play with that idea of being a bad Buddhist, or, having friends who sometimes try to take advantage of you by saying, that's not very Buddhist of you, which about 95% of the time is just somebody saying, I'm trying to manipulate you here and you won't let me.
Right. It's a judgment or an accusation of the phrase I've been using is, they're emptier than thou. And that never goes very far with me.
Yeah. Good.
Well, for folks who are listening to the podcast, you can find out more about Ethan and his work on his website, and we're linking that on the episode page, as well as a link to the book. Ethan, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate speaking with you again.
Thanks so much, Ted, and have fun storming the castle.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.